The morning mist clung to the Thames River like a shroud of destiny, obscuring the fate that awaited two armies poised for collision on this fateful October day in 1813. Major General William Henry Harrison stood atop his horse, surveying the muddy terrain that would soon be baptized in blood and glory. The War of 1812 had reached a pivotal moment, and the very soul of the Northwest Territory hung in the balance. Behind Harrison stretched nearly 3,500 American soldiers, their blue uniforms dampened by the persistent drizzle that had plagued the region for days. These men had marched through treacherous wilderness, driven by a singular purpose: to crush the British Indian alliance that had terrorized American settlements for months. The memory of Detroit's humiliating surrender still burned in their hearts, fueling their determination for redemption. Across the swampy ground, British General Henry Proctor commanded a force of roughly 600 British regulars and nearly 1,000 Native American warriors led by the legendary Tecumseh. The Shawnee chief, now in his 45th year, had become a symbol of indigenous resistance against American expansion. His presence alone inspired fear and respect in equal measure among both friend and foe. The strategic importance of this confrontation could not be overstated. Control of the Great Lakes region would determine whether British influence would continue to dominate the northwestern frontier, or whether American sovereignty would finally extend uncontested to the Mississippi River. The recent American naval victory at Lake Erie under Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry had already shifted the balance, forcing the British to abandon Detroit and retreat eastward along the Thames River Valley. Historical context referenced from the National Archives documentation of the War of 1812 campaigns. As dawn broke through the autumn clouds, both commanders understood that this battle would decide more than territorial control. For the Americans, victory would secure their northwestern frontier and potentially end British support for hostile Native American tribes. For the British and their indigenous allies, defeat would mean the collapse of their strategic position. In the entire Great Lakes region, Tecumseh had grown increasingly suspicious of General Proctor's intentions. The British retreat from Detroit had been hasty and poorly coordinated, abandoning crucial supplies and strategic positions. The great chief sensed that his British allies were more concerned with preserving their own forces than maintaining their promises to the Native American Confederation he had so carefully constructed over the previous decade. The terrain itself seemed to favor neither side completely. The Thames River meandered through marshy lowlands, creating natural obstacles that would complicate cavalry charges and artillery deployment. Dense forests bordered the battlefield, offering potential cover but also concealing unknown dangers. The muddy ground from recent rains would make rapid maneuvers difficult, potentially turning the engagement into a brutal test of endurance and will. Harrison's army included regular infantry, Kentucky mounted volunteers, and a small artillery contingent. The Kentucky cavalry, led by Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson, represented the cream of frontier fighters, men who had learned warfare in the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier. These soldiers understood that they were fighting not just for military victory, but for the safety of their families and communities back home. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through American history, determining the fate of nations and the destiny of the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the 13 original states. Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson adjusted his saber as he rode among his Kentucky mounted volunteers, their horses snorting vapor in the cold morning air. These were not ordinary cavalrymen, but frontier warriors who had cut their teeth fighting Creek and Cherokee war parties in the dense forests of Kentucky and Tennessee. Each man carried personal grievances against the British Indian alliance that had brought terror to their doorsteps. The psychological warfare had already begun. Throughout the early morning hours, Native American war cries echoed across the battlefield, designed to unnerve the American forces. Tecumseh's warriors painted their faces with sacred symbols, preparing their spirits for what many sensed would be their final stand against the advancing tide of American settlement. The great chief himself moved among his followers, speaking words of encouragement in multiple tribal languages, reminding them of their sacred duty to protect their ancestral lands. General Proctor, meanwhile, struggled with mounting concerns about his tactical position. His British regulars, though disciplined and experienced, were vastly outnumbered and operating far from their supply lines. The retreat from Detroit had been a strategic necessity following Perry's naval victory, but it had also damaged morale. and stretched his forces thin across unfamiliar territory. Intelligence reports suggested that Harrison's army was larger and better supplied than initially estimated. The American commander faced his own challenges. Coordinating such a large force across difficult terrain required careful planning and clear communication. Harrison had learned from previous setbacks in the war, particularly the disasters at Detroit and the River Raisin, where poor coordination and inadequate intelligence had led to devastating defeats. This time, he was determined to maintain tight control over his units and avoid the tactical errors that had plagued earlier campaigns. Native American scouts on both sides provided crucial intelligence about enemy movements and positions. Tecumseh's warriors excelled at gathering information through stealth and woodcraft, while American scouts, many of them frontiersmen with years of experience tracking hostile war parties, provided Harrison with detailed assessments of British defensive preparations. This shadow war of intelligence and counterintelligence would prove as important as the coming battle itself. Documentation from the Ohio Historical Society archives provides detailed accounts of pre-battle preparations and troop movements. The morning progressed with increasing tension as both armies completed their battle preparations. American artillery crews checked their cannon and calculated firing angles, while British engineers hastily constructed defensive positions using fallen logs and natural terrain features. The sound of axes cutting timber and soldiers calling orders created a constant background noise that mixed with the natural sounds of the river valley. Religious services were conducted in both camps as soldiers prepared their souls for potential death. American chaplains led prayers for victory and protection, while British officers read from the Book of Common Prayer. Among the Native American warriors, shamans performed traditional ceremonies, calling upon ancestral spirits to guide their weapons and protect their people in the coming fight. The weather continued to play a significant role in pre-battle conditions. The persistent dampness made firing flintlock muskets more difficult and unreliable, potentially favoring close combat over long-range engagements. Cavalry movements would be hampered by muddy ground, while infantry formations might become bogged down in the swampy terrain near the river. As the sun climbed higher, both commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans. Harrison decided to deploy his forces in a line formation that would maximize his numerical advantage while maintaining flexibility for tactical adjustments. Proctor, recognizing his disadvantageous position, prepared to conduct a fighting withdrawal that would inflict maximum casualties on the advancing Americans while preserving as many of his own forces as possible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of an entire region and potentially alter the course of the war itself. At precisely 11:30 in the morning, General Harrison gave the order that would unleash fury upon the Thames River Valley. "Forward march!" The command rippled through American ranks like wildfire, and 3,500 soldiers began their advance across the muddy battlefield toward British positions entrenched along the riverbank. The opening American assault came not from infantry, but from Colonel Johnson's mounted Kentucky volunteers. These frontier cavalrymen charged directly into the center of British lines, their horses' hooves thundering against the soft earth, sabers glinting in the pale October sunlight. The audacity of a mounted charge against prepared infantry positions shocked both British regulars and Native American warriors, who had expected a more conventional infantry advance. British musket fire erupted in disciplined volleys, sending lead balls whistling through the autumn air. Several Kentucky horses stumbled and fell, throwing their riders into the mud. But the majority of American cavalry pressed forward with relentless determination. Colonel Johnson himself led from the front, his sword raised high as he shouted encouragement to his men. The psychological impact of seeing their commander charging directly into enemy fire inspired the Kentucky volunteers to extraordinary acts of courage. Tecumseh, positioned with his warriors on the British right flank, immediately recognized the danger posed by the American cavalry assault. The great chief rallied his followers with a war cry that could be heard across the entire battlefield, then led a countercharge designed to blunt the American advance. Native American warriors emerged from concealed positions among the trees, their tomahawks and war clubs ready for close combat. The collision between Johnson's cavalry and Tecumseh's warriors created the battle's most intense and chaotic moment. Horses reared and screamed as warriors grabbed bridles and attempted to drag riders from their mounts. Sabers clashed against tomahawks in deadly duels that lasted mere seconds, but determined life and death. The air filled with war cries, shouted, orders, and the screams of wounded men and animals. Battlefield accounts preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archives document the ferocity of the initial cavalry engagement. General Proctor watched the developing battle with growing alarm from his command position near the river. The speed and violence of the American assault had disrupted his defensive plans and forced him to commit reserves earlier than intended. British regulars maintained disciplined firing lines, but their relatively small numbers made it difficult to cover the entire battlefield effectively. American infantry, following closely behind the cavalry charge, began engaging British positions with coordinated musket volleys. The disciplined advance of blue-uniformed soldiers presented a stark contrast to the swirling melee of mounted combat occurring simultaneously. Infantry officers maintained tight control over their units, ensuring that volleys were delivered with maximum effectiveness against British defensive positions. The terrain itself became a combatant in the struggle. Muddy ground made rapid movement difficult for both sides, while the marshy areas near the Thames River channeled attacking forces into predictable avenues of advance that British defenders could target with concentrated fire. Fallen logs and natural obstacles provided cover for both attackers and defenders, creating a complex battlefield where individual initiative often mattered more than grand tactical schemes. Native American warriors demonstrated their superior knowledge of forest warfare by using natural concealment to launch devastating ambushes against advancing American units. Small groups of warriors would appear suddenly from behind trees or fallen logs, deliver deadly fire at close range, then disappear back into the forest before American soldiers could organize effective counterattacks. This guerrilla-style combat proved highly effective against conventional military formations. As the battle intensified, both sides began taking heavy casualties. The muddy ground became slippery with blood, and the cries of wounded men mixed with the ongoing sounds of combat. Medical personnel from both armies worked frantically to evacuate wounded soldiers from the immediate battle zone, often under direct enemy fire. The outcome of the entire engagement began to hinge on the personal duel developing between Colonel Johnson and Tecumseh, two leaders whose courage and determination embodied the larger struggle between expanding American settlement and Native American resistance to that expansion. The decisive moment of the Battle of the Thames crystallized around a single deadly encounter that would echo through American history for generations. Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson, bleeding from multiple wounds but still mounted on his war horse, found himself face-to-face with Tecumseh in a clearing near the British right flank. The great Shawnee chief, his face painted for war and his eyes blazing with defiant courage, raised his tomahawk for what both warriors sensed would be their final confrontation. Johnson's pistol discharged with a thunderous crack that momentarily silenced nearby combat. Tecumseh staggered, struck by the lead ball, but remained standing through sheer force of will. The legendary chief attempted one last charge toward his enemy, tomahawk raised high, before collapsing to the muddy ground of the Thames River Valley. The man who had united dozens of tribes in resistance against American expansion drew his final breath on October 5, 1813, at approximately 12:15 in the afternoon. The death of Tecumseh sent shockwaves through Native American ranks that were immediately felt across the entire battlefield. Warriors who had fought with supernatural courage suddenly found their spiritual leader gone, his powerful presence no longer inspiring their resistance. The psychological impact proved as devastating as any military maneuver, causing organized Native American resistance to begin crumbling within minutes of their chief's fall. British General Proctor, witnessing the collapse of his Native American allies and recognizing the hopelessness of his tactical position, made the difficult decision to order a general retreat. His regulars, though still maintaining disciplined formations, were vastly outnumbered and increasingly isolated as their indigenous allies began withdrawing from the battlefield. The retreat quickly devolved into a rout as American forces pressed their advantage with renewed vigor. Kentucky mounted volunteers, emboldened by their colonel's victory over the legendary Tecumseh, pursued fleeing British forces with relentless determination. These frontier fighters had personal scores to settle with the British Indian alliance that had terrorized their communities for months. Their pursuit was marked by individual acts of vengeance that reflected the bitter nature of frontier warfare during this period. Military dispatches preserved in the War Department archives detail the immediate aftermath of Tecumseh's death and its impact on British defensive positions. American infantry advanced methodically across abandoned British positions, capturing artillery pieces, supply wagons, and military equipment that the retreating enemy could not carry away. The speed of the British collapse surprised even General Harrison, who had prepared for a much longer and more costly engagement. His forces had achieved a decisive victory in less than 2 hours of actual combat. The capture of British supplies proved strategically significant beyond the immediate tactical victory. Documents found among abandoned equipment revealed details of British military planning and intelligence about other frontier positions. This information would prove valuable for subsequent American operations in the Great Lakes region and help consolidate American control over the Northwest Territory. Native American casualties extended beyond immediate battle deaths to include the destruction of their political and military organization. Tecumseh's Confederation, built through years of patient diplomacy and shared resistance to American expansion, began fragmenting as individual tribes reassessed their positions and sought separate accommodations with American authorities. The death of their unifying leader marked the end of coordinated indigenous resistance in the Old Northwest. General Proctor's retreat continued eastward toward British strongholds in Upper Canada, but his force was severely weakened and demoralized. The loss of Native American allies meant that British influence in the Great Lakes region would never again pose a serious threat to American settlement and development. The strategic balance in the northwestern frontier had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Thames River battlefield, American soldiers began the grim task of collecting their dead and wounded while securing prisoners and captured equipment. The victory had been achieved at a relatively low cost in American casualties, making it one of the most successful engagements of the entire War of 1812. The battle's outcome would have ramifications extending far beyond the immediate military situation, fundamentally altering the relationship between the United States government and Native American tribes throughout the Great Lakes region. The immediate aftermath of battle revealed the true scope of American victory at the Thames River. General Harrison's forces had suffered fewer than 30 casualties, while British losses included nearly all of General Proctor's Native American allies and a significant portion of his regular troops killed, wounded, or captured. The disparity in casualties reflected both the effectiveness of the American assault and the collapse of organized resistance following Tecumseh's death. American soldiers methodically searched the battlefield for wounded comrades and valuable intelligence. Among the captured British equipment, they discovered correspondence between General Proctor and his superiors in Upper Canada that revealed the extent of British military weakness in the Great Lakes region. These documents confirmed that the victory at the Thames had effectively ended British ability to threaten American settlements in the Northwest Territory. The body of Tecumseh became the subject of immediate controversy and legend-making. American soldiers, seeking souvenirs from their historic victory, reportedly stripped skin from the fallen chief's body to make razor strops and other personal items. While these accounts may have been exaggerated in later retellings, they reflected the intense emotion surrounding the death of America's most formidable Native American opponent. Colonel Johnson's wounding during his confrontation with Tecumseh became a source of political capital that would later help propel him to the vice presidency under Martin Van Buren. The slogan, "Rumpsy Dumpsy, Johnson killed Tecumseh," would become a popular campaign chant, though historical verification of Johnson's specific role in the chief's death remained disputed among witnesses and historians. Native American survivors of the battle faced difficult choices about their future relationships with both British and American authorities. Some tribes attempted to negotiate separate peace agreements with the United States, while others fled deeper into Canadian territory to continue their resistance under British protection. The unity that Tecumseh had forged among diverse tribal groups dissolved rapidly without his charismatic leadership. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Ohio Statesman and Kentucky Gazette provide detailed coverage of the battle's immediate political and social consequences. General Harrison's victory transformed him into a national hero and launched his political career toward the presidency. The success at the Thames River, combined with his earlier defense of Fort Harrison and other military achievements, established his reputation as the most effective American commander in the Northwestern theater of war. This military fame would prove crucial to his subsequent political ambitions. The strategic implications of the victory extended throughout the Great Lakes region and beyond. British influence among Native American tribes, carefully cultivated over decades of trade and military cooperation, collapsed virtually overnight. American settlement patterns, previously constrained by the threat of British-sponsored Native American raids, could now expand more freely into previously contested territories. Economic consequences of the victory included the opening of new territories for American agricultural development and the elimination of British trade competition in the fur trade. American merchants and settlers, no longer threatened by coordinated British Native American resistance, began planning expansions into regions that had been effectively closed to American development since the beginning of the War of 1812. The psychological impact of Tecumseh's death resonated throughout Native American communities across North America. The great chief had represented hope for indigenous resistance to American expansion, and his fall symbolized the futility of military opposition to the growing power of the United States. Many tribal leaders began reassessing their strategies and seeking accommodation with American authorities. British military planners in Upper Canada were forced to completely revise their defensive strategies for the Great Lakes region. The loss of Native American allies meant that British forces would have to rely entirely on their own resources to defend Canadian territory against potential American invasion. This strategic weakness would influence British decision-making for the remainder of the war. The Battle of the Thames thus represented far more than a single military engagement. It marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power across the entire North American continent and set the stage for American continental expansion in the decades that followed. The weeks following the Battle of the Thames witnessed a complete transformation of the political landscape across the Great Lakes region. News of Tecumseh's death and the destruction of the British Indian Alliance spread rapidly through both American settlements and Native American communities, triggering responses that would reshape the entire frontier for generations to come. American settlers, emboldened by Harrison's victory, began moving into territories that had been virtually uninhabitable due to the constant threat of British-sponsored raids. Michigan Territory, Ohio's northwestern counties, and portions of Indiana that had been abandoned during the war's early phases experienced rapid repopulation as families returned to reclaim their homesteads and establish new communities. The collapse of organized Native American resistance led to a series of individual tribal negotiations with American authorities. The Treaty of Greenville's provisions, violated during the war by various tribal groups, were renegotiated under much less favorable terms for Native American parties. Tribes that had supported Tecumseh's Confederation found themselves with little bargaining power and were forced to cede additional territory in exchange for peace and minimal federal protection. General Proctor's retreat continued toward Burlington Heights, but his remaining forces were so weakened and demoralized that they posed no further threat to American positions. British military commanders in Upper Canada began concentrating their remaining resources on defending more strategically important positions, effectively abandoning the Western Great Lakes to American control. The international implications of the Thames victory extended beyond the immediate theater of war. British diplomats in Europe, already engaged in complex negotiations related to the Napoleonic Wars, found their bargaining position regarding North American territories significantly weakened. The destruction of their Native American alliance system meant that Britain could no longer credibly threaten American frontier settlements as a tool of diplomatic pressure. Diplomatic correspondence archived in the British Foreign Office records details the impact of the Thames defeat on broader British strategic planning. Native American communities throughout the region faced the difficult task of adapting to a new reality in which British support was no longer available and American power was effectively unopposed. Some tribal leaders sought to negotiate new relationships with American authorities based on accommodation and gradual integration, while others chose to migrate westward or northward to escape American jurisdiction entirely. The economic consequences of American victory manifested quickly in renewed trade and development activities. Fur trading companies, previously operating under constant threat of attack, re-established their operations throughout the Great Lakes region. American merchants began competing directly with British trading posts for Native American commerce, often offering better terms and more reliable access to American-manufactured goods. Religious and cultural changes accompanied the political transformation. American missionary societies, previously unable to operate safely in contested territories, began establishing missions among Native American communities. These religious institutions often served as agents of cultural assimilation, teaching English language and American customs alongside Christian doctrine. The victory at the Thames also influenced American military strategy for the remainder of the War of 1812. With the northwestern frontier secure, American forces could be concentrated for operations against British positions in Upper Canada and along the Atlantic coast. This redeployment of resources contributed to subsequent American successes in other theaters of the war. Individual stories of heroism and tragedy from the battle became part of American frontier folklore. Veterans of the Thames carried their experiences throughout the expanding nation, sharing accounts of the battle that grew more dramatic with each retelling. These stories helped establish patterns of American mythology about conquest and frontier warfare that would influence cultural attitudes for decades. The destruction of Tecumseh's Confederation represented more than a military defeat. It marked the end of an era in which Native American tribes could effectively challenge American territorial expansion through coordinated military resistance. Future Native American responses to American expansion would largely take the form of individual tribal actions or eventually desperate last stands by isolated groups rather than the organized confederation that Tecumseh had so skillfully constructed. 25 years after the Battle of the Thames, as America celebrated the 50th anniversary of its independence, the consequences of that October day in 1813 had transformed the entire character of the North American continent. The death of Tecumseh and the destruction of his confederation had opened floodgates of westward migration that seemed unstoppable, fulfilling dreams of continental empire that had existed since the nation's founding. Michigan achieved statehood. In 1837, its population swelled by settlers who had streamed into territories made safe by Harrison's victory. Cities like Detroit, previously vulnerable frontier outposts, grew into major commercial centers connecting the Great Lakes to eastern markets. The economic development that followed American military success created wealth and opportunity that drew immigrants from across the Atlantic, fundamentally changing the demographic composition of the entire region. Native American tribes that survived the collapse of Tecumseh's Confederation faced increasingly difficult circumstances as American settlement pressure intensified. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced many eastern tribes to relocate westward, often to territories far from their ancestral homes. The resistance that Tecumseh had organized represented the last effective military challenge to this policy of forced relocation. William Henry Harrison parlayed his military fame into political success, serving as the 9th President of the United States until his death 31 days after inauguration in 1841. His campaign slogan "Tippecanoe and Tyler too" referenced his earlier victory over Tecumseh's brother at the Battle of Tippecanoe, demonstrating how military success against Native American resistance remained politically valuable decades after the actual conflicts. Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson's disputed claim to have personally killed Tecumseh became a cornerstone of his political career, helping him achieve election as vice president under Martin Van Buren. The slogan associating Johnson with Tecumseh's death remained popular with voters who viewed the destruction of Native American resistance as a patriotic achievement worthy of political reward. The strategic consequences of the Thames victory extended far beyond the immediate region. American control of the Great Lakes, secured by the elimination of British Native American cooperation, facilitated the construction of canals and railroads that connected eastern cities with western territories. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, created economic opportunities that might not have been possible if British-sponsored resistance had continued threatening American settlements. Historical analysis from the American Historical Review's Centennial Edition provides comprehensive assessment of the battle's long-term consequences. British North America, later Canada, developed along different lines as a result of losing Native American allies in the Great Lakes region. Canadian-American border relations stabilized as British authorities recognized their inability to threaten American territorial integrity through indigenous proxies. This strategic reality contributed to the peaceful resolution of subsequent boundary disputes and the development of the world's longest undefended border. The cultural legacy of Tecumseh's death transcended immediate political consequences. The Shawnee chief became a tragic figure in American literature and popular culture, representing noble but doomed resistance to historical progress. This romanticized interpretation allowed Americans to celebrate their victory while maintaining sympathy for their defeated enemy, resolving psychological tensions about the moral costs of continental expansion. Historical memory of the Battle of the Thames evolved over time to emphasize American courage and Native American nobility while minimizing the role of disease, economic pressure, and demographic change in determining the conflict's outcome. This simplified narrative served political purposes by justifying territorial expansion while avoiding uncomfortable questions about justice and indigenous rights. The battlefield itself became a tourist destination and historical landmark, preserving the site where Tecumseh fell, and American continental expansion received crucial momentum. Monuments erected to commemorate the battle typically emphasized American heroism while acknowledging Native American courage, reflecting complex attitudes about conquest and resistance in American historical consciousness. By the time of the American Civil War, the consequences of the Thames victory had become thoroughly integrated into the nation's development. The secure northwestern frontier had provided resources and population that helped preserve the Union during its greatest crisis. The precedent of military solution to Native American resistance, established so decisively on that October day beside the Thames River, would be repeated tragically across the continent as America pursued its manifest destiny from sea to shining sea. The Battle of the Thames thus stands as a pivotal moment when the course of American history crystallized around the principle that indigenous resistance to territorial expansion would be met with overwhelming military force, establishing patterns of conquest and settlement that would define the continental nation for generations to come.